This video was produced by committee members of the Hotham History Project to honour Lorna, one of its founding members and its only chairperson, to commemorate her 90th birthday and to thank her for her support and dedication to the project over the 29 years of its existence. Lorna was filmed in conversation with three long-time friends. Kay Oak is a resident and, like Lorna, has contributed to the social and cultural history of North Melbourne over many years. Judy Walsh has known Lorna since 1967, being a fellow teacher of English and long-term family friend. I am Felicity Jack, a friend of all three, and I have been involved with the Hotham History Project since it began. I inadvertently said in the video that it has been running for 20 years. In fact, it will reach its 30th birthday in March 2025. Lorna brings insight and perspective into the history of the area of which she has been a resident for 60 years. Thank you, Lorna, for participating in this video and for your valuable contribution to the Hotham History Project over so many years.
Today I feel peaceful because I'm surrounded by good people.
Hi, I'm Kay, and this is Judy and Felicity, and we've reminiscing after Lorna's successful 90th birthday in October that we were all attended. I think the memorable thing about that party was just how many people were there and how many different organisations, events, things that Lorna represented and is involved in. And I think that we've just been talking about how many things Lorna does in the area. In some ways, Lorna epitomises North Melbourne culture. What do you think, Lorna?
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? When I came to live in North Melbourne, I didn't know I had any links with the area. And I had a great-grandmother who'd been living in Provost Street between husbands. I didn't discover her for quite a while.
Between her husbands, not you.
Yeah.
And that there had been quite a long history of some kind of contact between my family and this area of Victoria. And of course, like most of us here today, little or next to no contact with Indigenous Australia. Yeah. Even in our own local area.
Well, it is a special area, isn't it, North Melbourne? It's sort of quite a community, and Felicity and Judy have not living there now, but did live in North Melbourne, and I think we're all sort of, North Melbourne is an entity in itself, and there's so many different parts. And in some ways that's where the history group that Lorna's so involved in and established is so important, because you can look at the past as well as being in there. There's just so many parts that all link in together. But what do you think?
You look at North Melbourne and what you see is a very diverse kind of community with a solid base, of which the North Melbourne Town Hall, or currently called the Arts House, is a permanent reminder to everybody of this is North Melbourne. So there is a solid, comforting sign of a local community. But at the same time as there is that, there is also imminent change. Whole areas being flattened to be replaced by apartments. Change to the people and their way of relating to the community. So that at the one and the same time it's diverse and united, but divided. Do you agree with me?
Yes, I think, and that's true. And I don't know whether you two have seen that as well as being part of North Melbourne at one point too. It's sort of...
Yeah. Well, I moved into North Melbourne, I think it was 93, And at that time, there was a huge amount of manufacturing industry. Next door to me, there was a car service place. There was Bull ice cream across the road, and there are print places up in Leveson Street. It's all gone. Now the place next door to me is apartments all the way up Leveson Street. There's hardly any industry left around the area, and it's with people moving into flats. What I found about living in Courtney Street was that it was people would not stay very long, so that they didn't form roots, and so I'd get to know somebody and then they'd be moved on. Yeah, so, but that's a particular part of North Melbourne, I guess it's the people who bought the flats are probably more stable, but a lot of these places were rented and they'd come and they'd go.
We're going to talk about a lot of the examples of the activism that Lorna has been part of.
Well, here I've got something which is a memory of activism.
What's that?
What sort of thing could I possibly be holding in my hands?
Oh, show it around. Keep our pools open.
One of the greatest examples of community fervour and support was to keep the local swimming pool going. It didn't require much effort, really, to unite the people of the area, the residents, to the idea that we needed to keep the pool. A symbol of a household's support for the idea was to tie a yellow ribbon on the gate. So the streets of the area were aflutter with yellow ribbons.
What year was this about?
I shall have to ask the badge what year it was. 1970 something.
Yeah, it was early 70s, wasn't it? Yeah.
Look, I really think it was part of the legacy of Ruth Crowe.
Yeah.
Because when I went to live in North Melbourne, one of the images I have of life there is meeting Ruth Crowe in the street, Ruth carrying a bag, and in the bag were leaflets, and as I approached her she would be finding the leaflet that best suited her conversation of the moment, so that by the time we were opposite each other, she had the leaflet ready and the conversation was always there. Okay, now that's rather a fun description of a very serious activity. Ruth Crowe was determined that a community should be built for. She planned the ways in which suburban life could become more humane, more people-centred.
And she, like you, spent a huge amount of your living hours making sure that it happened.
Ruth could not stop herself. And when we look at the history of the area, we've got women from the beginning of the 20th century on. First of all, the suffragette-like women who signed the petition to get the vote, coming right down through to Ruth, and to people who really cared about the community. And I don't know how it happened, but there was this kind of acceptance of where the boundaries were. Who decided? I don't know. But the boundaries were Victoria Street, Flemington Road,
The creek.
and...
Yeah, but they were the particular one. I mean, they were there because they were geographic, weren't they?
But they became more than geographic. They became a way in which North Melbourne was itself. It had boundaries, and if you lived inside those boundaries, you knew you lived in North Melbourne. I stood for the council because I wanted to say thank you. At that stage of my life, I had 4 daughters who'd grown up in the local community, and I was grateful to the people who lived around me for the sort of life that we'd had as a family. So in the 1990s, I twice stood for council, twice because in between the first and the second time Kennett dismissed councillors and the councils of Victoria. The main interest I had when the first time I was on council was the very real issues that people like Felicity faced. Felicity, explain.
Well, I just moved back into the area from having lived down in Latrobe Valley, and for some reason I forgot to pay my rates on time, and so I was slugged with a huge fine. But Lorna very kindly sorted it out for me, and I didn't have to pay the fine. But I had to say that I'd never do it again. So I guess what that means is that Lorna was very approachable, and helpful. She'd take up issues which in themselves were minor, but for me it meant quite a lot.
An example too of the small issues as well as the big planning issues and other issues that you took part in.
Big ideas get their strength from the little actions that are used to support them. And being a city councillor representing the local area meant focusing on the little issues because they were important and because they added up to a local identity of fair play, if you can get it.
And you could do that because you were a community candidate, or as it were, you were a community councillor, as different to the old style of sort of the alderman who sort of ruled from above and looked down. But you were involved in the community and could bring community issues to the council. And there was sort of a change that was happening around that time as well.
And I couldn't have brought those issues up to council because I knew about them. I did that because I was told about them. People came and told me what was going on. And that mattered because it allowed people to feel that they had some control over the issue for themselves. It wasn't being taken out of their hands and dealt with by remote people on remote machines in remote offices.
Lorna, I see you as an activist. First of all, I noticed when I first met you in 1967 that you had a distinctly different domestic style to the one that I was used to. I think that I would like you to tell me about how you came to share your domestic life so forcefully with Bill, because that's what I saw as an enormous difference. Would you like to pick that up and tell us about it?
Yes, I would like to. I don't know whether I'm up to the task.
Well, I'll tell you about some of the details I noticed, and that might help you. Or do you want to do it yourself?
Here's what I remember in particular. One night when I hadn't been married to Bill for terribly long, I got hold of a magazine to read, and in it there was an article about Maria Rosa della Costa. She was an Italian feminist, and it was from her writing that I first got hold of the idea that women were not paid for doing their housework, that it was unpaid work. I remember sitting opposite Bill and explaining this idea to him. And it changed my life overnight. Just that simple realisation that hundreds of women were ironing and not getting paid for any of it.
You're lucky, Lorna, that Bill was as competent and as interested in food as he was, because that European experience, I think, brought more possibilities. I remember, and I think, although it's detail, it's important, I remember that we had, instead of bringing out some fancy flummery or pie or something, we had a piece of fruit. We had a pear or an apple. And you and I have talked about how that represents a saving of time for other interests, the lack of interest in complicated cooking. Can you tell us a bit more about that? About the sorts of things that saved you time to enable you to take part in neighbourhood life?
Well, listen, if Bill had remained the sort of husband who walked in the door and sat down and waited for dinner to be put on the table, can you imagine how different my life would have been? If everyone's going to have a fair go, domestic life and domestic work has to be shared. And not just shared so that the glamorous bits are done by one person and the drudging done by another, but proper sharing. And when you add children into the mix, they have to take their load too.
Which they did with a roster on the fridge, which I had a look at that night. Children were designated their roles.
Yes, and as full members of the community of the house.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, this leads to, I think, a favourite phrase of yours, which is the notion of an open family. Would you like to tell us about that?
Not only would I like to tell you about it, but I'd like somehow to bring it in. Families are too easily enclosed by the front door and the back door and the walls in between. Ideas and commitments have to be allowed in to that construct. If they aren't, there's no real democracy in the house. So in an open family, people learn more from outside than was the wont beforehand. You know what I mean?
So, Lorna, one of the things that amazes me about an onlooker, but a pretty detailed kind of onlooker on your domestic life, was how you made time for not only being active in the community, but reading, whether that reading was about ideas, educational ideas, or whether that reading was about the changes in women's position in the 60s and 70s. How do you see that you were able to give that priority to your intellectual and activist life?
The priority was not just my intellectual life, but the intellectual life of every member of the household. Right? And so the priority is for intellectual activity. And you get there by doing away with things that don't need to be done.
Because this is what made you the modern woman that I met in the just past the middle of the 60s. Greer was writing books, and so was Betty Friedan, and so were all kinds of people writing books. But you were showing me the example of what they were writing about. You were living it. No doubt you were reading about it too, but you were living it. Tell us about it.
What do you mean? Stuff like
not starching the doilies.
not having doilies at all.
Not having doilies at all. In fact, the dinner was on the tabletop, the old tabletop.
Yes, not on top of a tablecloth.
No. What other things did you dispense with?
The things I were doing in my teaching career were mirroring the changes in my domestic life, so that tasks were seen to be joint tasks. And in fact, I stopped approving of kids doing exams because they weren't there to be judged, but to learn. I gave up thinking of classes as individual students and thought of them as groups, which caused a change in classroom furniture.
What were you teaching at this point?
English.
Well, that's in your individual classrooms, but for me, it was the sharing of very attractive, involving ideas of that children could write about and talk about, and this was very much in the source books that I used as an English teacher. Tell us about the source books and other aspects of your creative teaching that you were able to share with others.
Well, we can all go back to the time when you were told to write a composition about, and there was the topic, discuss. And a piece of writing consisted of an introductory paragraph, 2 paragraphs developing the idea, and a concluding paragraph. Rubbish. Who wants to think like that? Who wants to be involved in that kind of sterile activity? And what do you do for the kid who hasn't got anything to discuss? Well, you make sure that there are some ideas there to be used. How do you do that? Kids have ideas. That's what they're alive for. That's what they want. They're hungry. Put in a little group to discuss what's going on. They produce more ideas than they started with. And they can share the work, so-called, can share the activity of using the ideas.
And I was privileged to use these source books and group work and associated practices in English teaching, and I can tell you they were just brilliant. Sunshine West 1970, classes of 45, and everything you've said worked. Everything that was implicit in the philosophy of the group work worked brilliantly.
Kids at home or kids at school or kids walking down the street, all of them enjoy activities like brainstorming. Like, it's fun. And brainstorming is a way of getting ideas to come to the surface so that you can pick out which of them you want and use them. Without that activity, I think I would have had half a life. What turned me into an activist? Well, one thing was, when I was 4 years old, my father was the headmaster of a primary school in the town of Numurkah. Now, I don't know how I knew this, but one of the members of staff, I don't know how I knew this as an adult, but one of the members of staff was a bloke called Phil Edmonds. And on one occasion, when the national anthem was being sung, he lay on his back in the schoolyard and blew smoke rings. Now, who could not be stunned by that? Those smoke rings hang in my mind as a symbol for do something about it. You can't just let a casual deciding that if things aren't good enough pass you by without having at least a passing thought about how to improve things. And we owe it to each other and to the kids to see that we keep the enthusiasm going for good ideas and smoke rings.
You as one, probably the main instigator of Hotham History Project, can you tell me what it was that led you to form the group and how it is that it's existed now for nearly 20 years, and a lot of that's through your own energy and commitment?
Any community deserves opportunities to look at itself. What we had 20 years ago, or around about 20 years ago in North Melbourne, we were standing right at the edge of a big change to what the area felt like as home. A big change which enabled us, before we met this challenge of the change, to reach back almost to 1900, to reach back into the past and to work out what we were going to carry forward with us into the future. Who wouldn't want to carry forward the tradition of feminism that predated, that stemmed from the 1900s and the women who were challenging the world to give them the right to vote? But great ideas can be lost if they're not followed. And the people who lived in North Melbourne deserved to know what possibly made up the traditions that they followed daily. It's in the hope of carrying on the good and examining the failures, it's that has kept me interested in the Hotham History Project. But I'm also not just interested in that, I'm actually interested in the stories, yarns about people like Horry the butcher from Happy Valley, who used to carry a football over to give the kids at the Errol Street School a real Sharon to play with in the winter.
So I'm really aware that in the write-up of the North and West Melbourne News of Lorna's 90th birthday party, there was a really delightful little poem which her husband Bill has written, and maybe Kay, you can read it out to us.
Lorna, her sight is fading, glare closes her eyes. I imagine her laugh is darkling, but all her family sees is the light within.
Beautiful, isn't it?
It's a beautiful poem, God.
Have only warm words for each other.